But the idea of European politicians, both nationally and on the EU level, that they are so safely in their institutional framework that public anger can never throw them out of their saddle. I think that's a very, very optimistic way to look at it. In 1988, nobody believed that 4 years later the Soviet Union would be gone.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for joining us. Let's talk about the European Union and its direction. Is the European Union heading towards disaster because of its policies on Ukraine, because of its policies on energy? I know that this is something that you've been talking about recently on X, comparing it to the French Revolution. Go ahead.
Wow, now you took away my banger of a line. Yes, but I think the comparison with the French Revolution is a very good one. And as you know, as a history buff, is one of the reasons why the French Revolution happened in the first place was because the French monarchy had huge expenditures in their support for the American War of Independence, for the American Revolutionary War. They were hoping that they would get the Caribbean and that ultimately it would be to their economic benefit. That did not happen. And then everybody knows the history, right? They had to call for a General Assembly, and pretty much out of a fiscal crisis, a political crisis emerged that ultimately led to the end, or the temporary end, if you want, of the monarchy. And of course, then you had Napoleon. And, there's always this joke when you go to a library and ask where you can find the French Constitution. The answer is, well, it's over there at periodicals. I think they're currently at their 5th Republic. I'm sure we're going to see the 6th Republic as well. But I believe that this historical comparison is a more helpful one than the usual one you hear in the European media, where it's always the 1930s and it's always Munich and it's always 1938. And even that comparison, by the way, I think is mistaken, because if you look at the history of World War II, just as a quick digression, France and Britain, whether that decision was correct or not is a separate issue, but at least at the beginning, if you look at what happened with Poland, with Norway, with Denmark, they understood that in order to meet Germany head on, they needed time to prepare. They needed time to rearm, to organize their economy, and so on and so on. And of course, even after 1945, we have to be as honest and say not everybody was liberated. I mean, if you ask the people in Poland, if you ask the people in the Czech Republic and Hungary, they tell you a slightly different story. I'm saying this because one of the claims that is currently being made regarding the potential peace negotiations is that an aggressor can never be rewarded. Now, morally, that's a fair argument. Historically, there are plenty of histories where aggressors have been rewarded for the sake of peace, right? I mean, you could argue that in 1871, when Prussia invaded France, why did they get Alsace-Lorraine? Weren't they the aggressors? You could make the argument that when Frederick the Great took Silesia from Austria, was he rewarded? Yes, it happens all the time, because unfortunately in international politics, power is not the only, but the main currency, and this has not changed. Now, talking about the European Union, there is a significant risk that a political endeavor, both on the supranational European level, but also on the local levels, that is increasingly losing legitimacy if they start to engage in a military conflict that comes at significant economic cost, that at some point the people will tend towards revolution, either at the ballot box or in the streets. I think a revolution does not always have to be, pitchforks and revolt in the street. It can also be a revolution at the ballot box. Then you have parties that are very critical of the European Union, as we saw in Slovakia, as we saw in the Czech Republic, as we increasingly see in Germany, according to the polls, in Austria, and in other places. I don't think that's entirely unlikely. And to make a last historical comparison, that might be a little bit far-fetched, but I think it's a worthwhile to make, that maybe the French Revolution is one part of the comparison, but the other one is the Russian Revolution, where you had a very unpopular regime under the Romanovs, under Nicholas II, and they believe that actually they can entrench their popularity with a war. It didn't work in 1905 with the war against Japan, and then it didn't work out with World War I, and ultimately they lost. So the idea, this might be the most extreme scenarios, but the idea of European politicians, both nationally and on the EU level, that they are so safely in their institutional framework that public anger can never, throw them out of their saddle. I think that's a very, very optimistic way to look at it. And a last historical comparison, I promise, at least for this beginning of our conversation. In 1988, Nobody believed that 4 years later the Soviet Union would be gone. Right? People said, okay, the Soviet Union is going to reform, but it's more or less going to stick around for the foreseeable future. So none of us will experience the end of the Soviet Union, and those who claimed otherwise were on the fringes, and they were described as cranks and idealists and whatnot. 4 years later, 1992, the Soviet Union in its entirety was history. So again, I'm not saying the EU is the Soviet Union, although we can talk about this as well. There are tendencies that as public disillusionment is growing, instead of addressing the things that make people angry, there is a tendency to maybe not outright suppress, but let's say make it more difficult for people to express that anger, whether it's trying to ban parties. Now there is this new democracy shield being discussed, which is more or less an infringement on freedom of speech. We saw the whole let's call it shady business with the Romanian presidential elections. There are discussions of how could you ban certain AfD candidates in Germany from running. So there are all these things being put in place that are designed to keep those who are in power and to, let's at least diminish the chances of actual political change. And this is very often the first step before a revolutionary eruption.
You talk about the Soviet Union. That's a great theme to stick with, I think. So obviously the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and they really got bogged down in this war of attrition against these kind of Muslim tribes in the mountains, and they actually had to pull out of Afghanistan. Complete disaster, obviously, for the Soviets. The European Union isn't fighting a direct war with Russia. This is a kind of proxy war with Ukraine as the proxy, but they are spending a vast amount of money on resources for Ukraine. And when you see clips of the former Finnish Prime Minister, when she was asked how will the war in the Ukraine end, and she simply replied, with Russia leaving Ukraine's territory, one just boggles the mind thinking of this utter idealistic, frankly delusional attitude of some European politicians. What do you make of Europe's role right now in the peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, which are obviously being fueled and headed by the Trump administration? It seems to an extent that Europe is being sidelined, and that their role is really to try and stop the negotiations from happening and to help Ukraine as much as they can when it comes to the Ukrainians' points on sovereignty and territory and so on.
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned this resurfacing video of Sanna Marin, the then Finnish Prime Minister, because I think just a couple of days ago, there is going to be one of these, it's within the European Union framework, right? If a country has too much of a budget deficit, there is some process that can potentially punish them. It's the usual EU bureaucracy thing. But this is now something that might happen to Finland because they have overextended their fiscal position due to their support for Ukraine, which again might be great from a moral perspective. But, and I don't want to overstretch this comparison, but you could make the same case in 1776 and say, well, from a moral perspective, the French support for the American revolutionaries was absolutely justified, but ultimately it created the conditions for the monarchy to be overthrown. And I think the same is true in the European case, that you can go out and make these great statements. And it's not just the former Finnish Prime Minister, you have Ursula von der Leyen and Manfred Weber, right? You have all these speeches, these internet clips where they speak in a similar fashion. But ultimately, as you just, I think, quite eloquently said, there is political reality and then there's rhetoric, and there's always a gap between those two, but at some point this gap can become too large, and this is what we experience in Europe. And give me some concrete numbers. Fine, like you want to, let's say the policy goal is the complete ouster of Russia from the occupied territories in Ukraine. Let's say this is the goal. What kind of sacrifices, what is the trade-off, if you want, the cost that would be necessary to accomplish this? And then you have to look at, would the European economy be capable of doing it? And secondly, would the European people be willing to shoulder that cost? And I think the answer to both of the things is no. The finances of European states are not in a very good condition. There are differences between the individual states, but I think it is fair to say that France is on the brink of a new fiscal crisis that could trigger a new euro crisis. The conditions in Germany, particularly the long-term condition of Germany, is not looking very good. Even the Financial Times, even The Economist, pretty much every media is admitting this by now. And most people do not want a decrease of their living standards. So the idea that is now being floated, going to the 28 points or any of those, I think 4 different peace proposals that have been out there. Now, paper is very patient. So whatever you put on there, the question is, can you actually then execute it? And just to pick out one element of this, the former Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, like he tweeted recently that he's like very excited because both the UK and France apparently have at least tentatively committed to putting 20,000 peacekeepers into Ukraine. Now, the question, and this is something that you observe very keenly in your own reporting, I think that most members of the British Armed Forces and the British public would say, we are at the moment more concerned with the protection of our own borders and not the Donbass. And I would make the same argument in France. I mean, France is a country where it is impossible or almost impossible to increase the retirement age by a year or 2 years, but the same people who cannot be persuaded to save the welfare system by working 2 years longer are now expected to potentially die on the new Eastern Front. I just think that's entirely unrealistic. And I immediately hasten to add, the point is not if you or I agree with this policy or disagree. The point is that it is completely unrealistic. And another point that I think is very important, what we are observing at the moment in Ukraine and in Russia is a war of attrition. So usually the side that wins a war of attrition is the side that can outproduce the other side. So if you look at ammunition production, steel production, drone production, all these elements that are important for an actual war on the battlefield, the combined forces of Russia, China, and to a smaller extent Iran, they are at the moment outproducing NATO, they're outproducing Ukraine, which means that in such a conflict, for the time being, Moscow has more leverage than anybody else. So this means that if Russia should agree to a peace, it will, given the current conditions, it will always be a peace that meets many of Russia's demand because they have more leverage. And I'm so sorry to repeat myself. I say again, I'm not saying this because I like it. I'm not saying this because I think it's good. I'm just saying this because this is objectively the situation as it presents itself.
So I have to correct you on something. There was no moral obligation or moral justification for France supporting those tax dodgers in 1776. But we can move on from that. A lot of people have been talking about Germany rearming and perhaps even Germany leading NATO. That was something suggested by a US official recently. What do you make of this idea of Germany in particular becoming the major European arms power? Obviously, there's a lot of historical, you talk a lot about historical comparisons. There's a lot of historical angst, perhaps from people in Poland and other places, with Germany rearming itself. What do you make of this idea of Germany becoming that dominant European arms power? Because historically, in the last sort of 70 years, it's really been Britain and France leading that.
No, I think you're right. And one of the issues I have with this idea is there seems to be this imagination, at least on some part of the political class, that you can just flick a switch and completely alter the cultural, social changes of, let's say, the last 40 years. I mean, the Germans, for better or worse, I would argue, have become as obnoxiously pacifist as they once have been obnoxiously warlike. And this is not something you can just change from one day to the other. We see this currently with the debate of the reintroduction of conscription in Germany. There's huge resistance from the public. There's huge resistance, particularly from young men who justifiably say, you have been telling us in schools, in universities, in the media for 40 years, nationalism is bad, patriotism is bad, the military is bad. Like pretty much everything you need as a backbone for a country capable of defending itself, not just in economic terms, in equipment terms, but also in mental terms and psychological terms, that you want to fight for your country. Just as an anecdote, there was this movement during, I think they were in 2006, I don't want to say something wrong, when the World Football Championship was in Germany. There was this movement where people could trade in their German flags for, I don't know, for handbags or something, as a movement to say, because we don't want to appear too nationalistic. So not even 20 years ago, there was a genuine movement saying you should not even cheer your own football team during a World Cup. So the same people now say, well, the Germans they must get ready to potentially sacrifice themselves in a war between Russia and Ukraine. And as I said before, that's an interesting opinion to have, but I think it's completely detached from reality. And secondly, because this is a topic that is very often treated separately, but I think in this area they overlap. Many German men particularly say, so you're basically telling us that simultaneously we have a migration policy where young men from other countries are moving into our welfare state, so we have to pay for them, but you tell us that we have to move, potentially at least, in a conscripted army to Ukraine or to the Baltic states to fight a war against Russia. So you're saying that the German taxpayer and young men have to fight Russia, and the young guy coming from Syria does not have to fight in a war, does not have to pay taxes, and is living off the welfare state. So this is, even from a moral perspective, something that most Germans, I would believe at least, are not going to agree with. And secondly, which is also crucial, the party that is strongest pushing for the German rearmament and kind of newfound German militarism are the Greens. And the ones most opposed to it, at least in parts, is the AfD. But if you look at the party whose members have actually served in the military, who actually were part of the military when conscription was still around a couple of years ago, they are members of the AfD. So of course they say, are you kidding us? The same party that was turning against the German military at every occasion is now saying, oh, you guys potentially have to go and fight in a war. So they have no legitimacy on this. So all of this is interesting on paper. These are interesting positions. But I believe that, and Germany is just a microcosm. I think the same is true in France, and you know this better than I do, but I think the same would also be true in the UK. There is no appetite among the populations at the moment to bring the economic or potentially personal sacrifice in such a conflict. And the Russians know that. I think this is one of the reasons why they believe that and they might be wrong, that they can push a hard bargain, because they say at the end of the day, the Americans might be different, but the Europeans don't have the stomach to really endure a long-term conflict with Russia and China united. And I think that assessment is correct.
So I know that you're based in between Austria and Hungary, a kind of old Austro-Hungarian, citizen, if you like, traveling between Vienna and Budapest. I wonder, we'll just talk briefly about Austria and Hungary, because I think both countries are obviously very interesting, and what's going on now with immigration and politics in both countries fascinates me. Are the Austrians looking towards Viktor Orban in Hungary when it comes to his immigration policy with envy? I mean, I know that Austria has also had significant problems, just like lots of other Western European countries, with a mass migration, whereas Hungary seems to have taken a slightly different path.
Yeah, I think that is a fair assessment. Maybe not, I'm not sure if I would use the term envy, but definitely with agreement. But yes, so particularly on the Austrian right. So the Austrian Freedom Party, which is our right-wing party, is currently, the last poll came out yesterday, they're currently polling at 37%. During the last elections in September of 2024, they got 29%. So we'll see what they will actually get in the next elections, which are scheduled to take place, unless there are snap elections, in 2029. So if they can actually keep if it would reflect the polls, or if it be higher or lower. And they are very much in line with Viktor Orban, with Fidesz. They regularly come to Budapest, they speak at events. So I think there's a very close alignment. And yes, I mean, there is a sense in Austria, and I think that sense is present in most Western European countries by now, that migration policy over the last 10, 15, some would say 20, 30 years has gone in the entirely wrong direction, and that a course correction is necessary. Because what we experience in Austria, in Germany, in the UK is, and this is a very interesting topic, right? It's not so much because people don't always look at the crime rates and say, well, if you look at crime rates, things haven't really gotten worse. But there is a constant anxiety. And I think the best way that describes this is, yes, the likelihood of terrorist attacks taking place at every Christmas market is very, very low. But every Christmas market is now preparing for a potential terrorist attack. And that creates a sense of anxiety, right? It's just not the same thing. It's if you go out and you want to have a cup of mulled wine and there is an armed to the teeth military guy standing next to you. On the one hand, you say, oh, this is for you to make you feel safe. But it also tells you that that guy has to be there now, because otherwise a completely mundane activity like going to a Christmas market is now a security risk. And I think the same is true in the UK, the same is true in Germany. There's this general anxiety, and people justifiably trace this back to the migration policy, because you don't have these anxieties and these protections for public events in Hungary, in the Czech Republic, in Poland and other Central and Eastern European countries.
So you mentioned at the beginning of the interview about the Soviet Union and comparing that to the European Union. Perhaps another interesting comparison that sticks within that theme is on European economic policy, and more specifically European energy policy, because that seems to me completely mad from almost like a Soviet style policy, where they're taking this very, very firm ideology of net zero or green energy or whatever, and they're imposing that against the economic reality that energy prices have massively skyrocketed in recent years, particularly in places like Britain and Germany. And I'll give you the British example. Instead of producing our own oil in the North Sea or our own gas through fracking, we're deciding to import liquefied natural gas from places like Qatar and even Norway. I mean, what do you make of this overall European Union energy strategy? And do you see a kind of similarity there with the economic and policies of the Soviet Union putting ideology above economic reality?
Oh, absolutely. And I think I couldn't have put it any better. I think that's the best way to put it. It's putting ideology before reality, something that historically the Germans have always been very keen of. I remain always surprised that the British tagged along with this idiotic policy. And Ed Miliband, for better or worse, is, I think, in this respect a disgrace. Like this idea of rooftop solar revolutions in the UK and whatnot is complete madness. And you see it with heavy industry closing down in the UK. You see it with heavy industry closing down all over Europe. And this to connect very quickly two dots here, which is, if you close down your blast furnaces, your aluminum smelters, your nickel production, and your enemy is expanding them, then again, in a war of attrition where it still depends on having tanks, having drones, having all these things, well, then the side who is producing them will have more leverage than the side stopping producing them. And we don't even have to talk about rare earth and all these kind of things, because you're correct. Hypothetically, both Britain and continental Europe, we could produce a lot of these things at home. But that would mean that you would have to ease environmental regulations, because that is dirty business, no doubt about it. Building mines, refining rare earth, very, very dirty, a huge toll on the environment. But this is always the trade-off, right? National security and the environment. Or as I kind of, ironically or cynically say, you can either go green or you can go to war, but you can't really do both of those things. Now, what really bothers me also about this is it's the shifting of the goalposts. Originally, the promise was that the energy transition, as it's called in Germany, or net zero, or the green revolution, whatever term you want to use, will be this amazing, miraculous thing that will make energy clean, energy cheaper, and everybody's living standards will go up. This was, if you go back to the reporting on it and how it was framed in the late 1990s, this was the argument, right? It's the more jobs, more wealth, cheaper energy. Now, we see that the exact opposite happened, and now it's going to be reframed into, well, what did you think? Saving the environment has its price. Well, first of all, it does have its price, that is correct, but this is not what we were promised, right? And I give you a direct, or a paraphrase slightly because he said it in German, but the previous German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, in March of last year said that, and this is the quote, he said that due to the energy transition, Germany will experience growth rates that were seen last during the economic miracle of the 50s and 60s, with growth rates of 4 to 6% per annum. Currently, what we see in Germany is a stagnation, or if you take out the government sector, an actual contraction of the German economy. So these promises that were made simply were not kept. And I think one reason for this is, as you alluded to, is that in addition to multiculturalism, I would argue that the obsession with climate, and again, I'm not denying climate change, but I'm talking more about the obsession with it, has become a form of a new religion. And as we all know, there is nothing the religious radical abhors more than evidence that would contradict their beliefs. And this is what we see now. There's a constant, the more evidence against European energy policy, against European climate policy you see, the more the politicians double down on it, which is a very, very absurd thing to observe. But it's, as I said, it's fighting up against an emotionally held religious belief with empirical facts is very difficult. And if you allow me to make one last point, because usually then people come with numbers and say, but Ralph, look at how much electricity in the European Union is now produced by wind and solar. Yes, absolutely. But the point is not, is something technologically feasible? The point is, does it make sense economically? I mean, hypothetically, you could run all of Europe on wind and solar. I mean, you would have your occasional blackout and you would have to ration electricity. So would it be possible from a technological viewpoint? 100%. But what would it do to European living standards? And would the people of Europe be willing to go along with it? And the second point, which is currently a huge debate in the UK, when we particularly look at things like nuclear energy, that we have created regulatory regimes that made it impossible to build, for example, nuclear power plants. All the same is, by the way, also true for hydropower. And now people say, well, you can't build nuclear because it's too expensive. Because we made it so expensive. I think there was Javier Blas, he does a great reporting on energy for Bloomberg. He had this quote that apparently like saving a single salmon close to a nuclear power plant in the UK is like I think £10 million or $10 million per salmon. So it's all these absurdities. Or that even I think nesting places for certain animals, that the animals cannot be moved, but you have to build around them. Or to put it differently, whatever the most expensive solution is, that is the solution that is being picked. And then you say, oh my God, this is so expensive, we cannot do it.
Okay, Ralph, thank you so much. Appreciate you joining us.